This recording is on Chapter 6, Governmental Influence on Trade. Um, we'll have to see if I can record this whole chapter in just one take, or I may break it up into part 1 and 2, depending on the duration of the lecture. Okay. Again, make sure you read Chapter 6 and you printed out the PowerPoint slides. These lectures are made to highlight some of the important issues in the chapters. It's not meant to replace the actual reading of the chapter for this. Okay. So learning objectives for this chapter explain why government tried to enhance and restrict trade. Now, this chapter is really important because anytime on a daily, regular basis, anytime you open up any newspaper, especially business-related newspapers, there's always trade issues going on, trade conflicts, trade retaliation. A lot of the governments have now, whether it was intended or in response to their trade partner, they really weaponized the trade. And weaponize that. We've seen this particularly with the highlight in terms of rise of China as China becomes more economically more powerful and militarily and other ways become more powerful. They become more assertive in their sovereignty issues to push forward their agenda. But having said that, every country engages in some form of influence on their trade. No sane government will allow goods of free to come into their country freely without some sort of regulations to ensure it protects the country's own sovereign interest. So looking at the learning objectives, we'll cover some of these items, explain why government tried to enhance and restrict trade, show the effects of pressure groups on trade policy, and we'll look at the stakeholders. Anytime you enhance trade or restrict trade, there are people who benefit and there are people who suffer from it. And that sort of complicates the issue. It's not always a win-win when governments start to intervene on the trade issues. It's like a balloon. You press one area and it expands the other, and so forth. So compare the potential and actual effects of government intervention on free flow of goods. Illustrate the major means by which trade is restricted and regulated. So, some of the tactics and strategies that governments utilize in order to restrict free flow of goods and how it impacts the different stakeholders, the actual tactics and means by which they do this. In that sense, this is probably one area where you'll hear about it, like I said, on a regular basis in the media. And they will even talk about specific trade restrictions that have been imposed. Okay. And then the result of this, other learning objectives demonstrate the business uncertainties and opportunities created by government trade policies. We see this all the time. Every time government intervenes in the free flow of goods, there are threats and there are opportunities. It could be a country-to-country opportunity. For example, when China started to restrict some commodities coming out of Australia, Brazil may have benefited to some of those because Brazil is another major commodity producing a country as well, and China is not going to restrict trade unless they can to substitute it with another country's commodity, especially for those items that are of sovereign interest, good for the nation, benefits the nation. For example, I think if you saw the video in Australia and China trade friction, iron ore as a commodity from Australia has largely been upheld because China needs steel in order to be able to build their infrastructures and continue their manufacturing. And it's not easy to replace the type of iron ore that are produced by Australia at a comparable price. So no government is just not going to restrict something and hurt itself unless they can substitute it, or unless it's a temporary measure, or unless it's not essential. Um, and so another learning objective: discern how businesses may respond to import competitions. If there are free trade agreements, and if the imports start to free flow goods coming in, how they can react to that. Fathom how growing complexity of product and trade regulation may affect the future. And we do live in a very complicated era now, with so many regulations, trade barriers, and it's been really difficult. How one can separate economics of trade and then the politics of trade. The intermingling of politics and trade has become really messy these days, because a lot of the governments now are intervening in trades in order to further their own national agenda, or even punish their partners for not supporting them in their political views and political agenda. Okay, so government's political objectives are sometimes really at odds with economic proposal and economic benefits. The trades are meant to lead to efficiencies in the nation's market, and to enhance international competitiveness. But this chapter really begins to discuss the reasons why and the ways in which government intervene in the international trade process. And then it looks at the economics and the non-economics effects of those actions on the participants. And finally, the chapters looks at the actual instruments of trade control, trade restrictions. There can be fall into two large categories of tariffs, and I'm sure you heard about tariffs, and non-tariff barriers. And then it concludes with discussion on the ways in which firms can deal with these adverse trading conditions, both at home and abroad. Okay, so looking at this, the fundamental, the basic definition. In principle, as I said before, no country permits a totally unregulated flow of goods or services across its border. Every country will endeavor to protect their physical borders, as well as the trade borders as well. So likewise, the government may choose to enable global competition in their own backyard, or they could engage in what we call protectionism. And way the textbook define protectionism refers to those government restrictions, and we have been primarily focused on restrictions. But also, when we talk about protectionism, we're also talking about incentives. Incentives that will help their own domestic firms to compete with the foreign competitors, both at home and abroad. So you can restrict the foreign competition from actually coming in, or restrict it by enacting tariff and non-tariff trade barriers. But also, they can do nothing against the foreign competition, but stack the barrier against foreign competition by helping your own domestic firms compete with the foreign competition through incentives. Okay. Now, the rationale for a government to do this may be either economic or non-economic in nature. Okay. Whatever and whenever the government choose to impede or make it difficult for the free flow of goods import to come into the country, and or encourage the free flow of export, they are in many ways intervening either directly or indirectly on behalf of their domestic firms, isn't it? Okay. Anytime they impede or enhance foreign competition, it also has a direct impact on domestic companies, unless they don't have any companies that produce that comparable product or services, of course. Okay. The next topic is the conflicting results of trade policy. Sometimes government enact things that they thought it would work in a particular way and it doesn't. Okay. Again, the governments may intervene in trade in order to attain economic, social, and political objectives, but they also do so for, in many cases, a political rationality, just political reasons. Even at the expense of hurting their own people, even at the expense of hurting their own markets, even at the expense of hurting their own companies, own countries, companies' competitiveness. Okay, but of course they will always tell you, whether truly or not, that these trade policies are enacted for the best protection of their own country as well as citizens. But sometimes it's also done in terms of personal political longevity. There's an assumption that all governments, as Canadians, that people live under a fair and electoral democratic society like we have. But vast majority of the countries, now I shouldn't say vast majority, but many countries do not have this freely elected, freely accountable politicians. So if you have a politician who's a dictator, runs a totalitarian government, a lot of the actions that they may take in terms of trade restrictions or trade incentive will be for personal reason at the great expense of his or her own people. Okay, it could be through bribery. It could be through how they would personally benefit his or her own family. Okay. But typically, anytime you intervene in trade policy, you will have winners and losers. It's difficult to balance that sometimes. So one of the things that you really have to look at when you're looking at what are the impacts, the actual impact of the trade conflicts or trade policies. Okay, and that's when we talk about the stakeholders, the people that may be directly or indirectly affected by government intervening in trades. It could be workers. A lot of the arguments when Trump was the president, make America great again. In many cases, when he erected trade barriers, he did it so on the claims that it is to protect the workers. First of all, protect the workers from losing jobs when the companies like Apple farm out their manufacturing to Foxconn, when Foxconn has major manufacturing facilities in mainland China. So, Trump may argue, why is Apple making first of all, it's headquartered in the United States, it's an American company, but also making so much money off of American consumers who buy Apple product, but why are you employing people in another country? So this make America great again, one of the things that he wanted to do was to bring job back. But it isn't just to the Trump, who's a Republican, but also Joe Biden, who's now the current president, Democratic. And Democrats, along with unions, would argue even more vigorously for keeping the job here, but also bringing back the job. Why is these Foxconn manufacturer of iPhones not have facility in the United States? Probably there are many reasons. Okay, but there was a lot of political pressure to have Foxconn potentially locate their manufacturing. Some of the arguments can be obviously the cost is lower in other countries to produce iPhone, like China. Another can be not only that the cost is lower. Cost can be many things. It could be the labor cost, which would be the obvious. It could be the work employment laws, where people in other countries can work 12, 18 hours a day or even more without having to pay time and a half. Or it could be employment regulations, where working environments are very much pro-business and relaxed, so people will work hard and not complain about this and that, about working long hours or working conditions. In many of these facilities, the employees actually live on site where they manufacture. They literally live and breathe day in and day out. It could be a number of skilled workers that are required to be able to manufacture these high techs. Some have argued that in order to amass technicians and engineers to be able to create this amount of products like Apple iPhones, you have to have numbers and quality of it, and you can only do that in some parts of the country. It would be very difficult to assemble at a relatively lower cost, difficult to assemble in the United States. So workers, the stakeholders, workers can benefit from trade policy, or it can be undermined. They may lose their job or their salary goes down. One of the things that they were concerned about when they initially enacted NAFTA, now what's it called? Mexico USA Can, or USA Mexico Can agreement. Potentially American workers and Canadian workers worry about losing their jobs to Mexican workers, and afraid that a lot of companies may relocate. So unions and politicians are very sensitive to this. Another stakeholders are the owners. That would include the actual owners of the company, but also people who hold shares in the company as well as investors, how that might impact it. Suppliers, local politicians, and so forth. I mean, some of the trade policies are done at the federal level, but it could potentially impact politicians, local politicians. What if they lose? What if a company in Ohio have to close down factories because they cannot? They're relocating to another country where the labor is much cheaper, the cost is much cheaper. It has an enormous impact. There are cities where they have when they're so dependent on one or two companies, when the companies close up their manufacturing, the city became a ghost town. Okay. Consumers can also be impacted. Consumers, it says, usually don't care. Well, it depends who the consumers are. I wouldn't say they don't care. I mean, a lot of consumers, first of all, aren't aware of it. Of the trade policy. Now, as a business student, you may be aware of it. Because I suppose the reason why they say consumers usually don't care is that consumers generally purchase product with very little thoughts as to where the products are produced. Okay, but consumers do care because it affects their pocketbooks, right? If the products are sold at a lower price, then you have more disposable income left over to spend on other things, as opposed to costs keep going up. Okay, but most people don't know what they're purchasing unless they're protesting against a particular country or a particular product. People just buy it, right? Because that's what they need. Another thing is, I suppose arguments can be made that import barrier costs can be spread out over a large amounts of goods, so the individual consumer impact is not that great. But you can't say this, right? Although the textbook says this. Oil is another example. When there's a rise in oil prices, we'll talk about later on, it could impact people who drive it. If you essential goods where you need toilet papers and other things, if the paper suppliers' product go up because of government interventions, that's going to have an impact. And over the course of durations where you need these products, it will have an impact on the economies. Now, economic rationale for government interventions. Okay, these are some of the very common, typical reasons why governments claim or others claims that government should intervene, governments have intervened, and so forth. One of the common economic rationale for government intervention has been for fighting unemployment. Okay, if your own workers have difficulty finding jobs or finding jobs that have very good pay or comparable compensation, okay, that's a problem. If the unemployment is high and the government has to pay out unemployment benefits in order for people to survive, that's a problem. If the people can't find job and they go on social welfare, that's a problem. Okay, so whether it's a liberal party, conservative parties, or NDP, or in the United States, whether it's Republicans and Democrats, they've argued on behalf that their trade policies will protect the current workers, even raise their living standards and their salaries and pay. And they've demonstrated in the past that they're willing to do this. So unemployment, if the unemployment is increasing or gets high, the current administration may be in a difficult situation. Okay, but if you are economics students or if you take an economics, it is very unlikely that countries can have a full employment. So unemployment is an issue for every country. Okay. Now, if the unemployment increases or persists, then many of these people may call for protectionism. And one of the probably the most effective organizations to do this are the unions or the organized labor. They would argue by limiting imports, local jobs are retained as firms and consumers are forced to purchase domestic products, goods, and services. Okay, so either make the foreign products coming in more expensive than ones that are produced domestically, or just limit those coming in, or outright restrict it from coming in, then people have no choice except to consume domestically produced goods and services. Okay, but in many cases, in a large country like Canada and United States, even if you were to do this perfectly, you would still have unemployment. If you take an economics, unless you're a very tiny country, it's hard to achieve 100%. There's always a slack. There's always people who are unemployed but are not maybe employable. I've seen a lot of people who are really irresponsible, incompetent. I would never hire them for whatever reasons. On the other hand, they may result in a decline in export-related jobs. Okay, so if you engage in this protectionism, other countries will do it as well. They're not going to allow you to have full access to the market, and you don't give them the equal full access. So in fact, some of the goods and products that you're exporting to that partner country, they may start restricting those in terms of retaliation. So in fact, that might lead to even higher unemployment. Okay, that could also lead to higher unemployment. It could increase your costs for some of the components that are needed, lower your income from abroad because of restrictions from foreign. So the key word here, although you may have a rationale for intervening in trade as a government intervene, there's always a reaction. Where there's an action in trade, there's a reaction. And so when you start government making these interventions, your other foreign countries that are hurt by your actions will also retaliate in kind. Okay, so it's possible you may even lose out even more. It's possible your unemployment may even go up even more. So you got to be very careful with that. Okay, so retaliation is a very common thing if you engage in protectionism or intervene in the markets. So government must carefully balance the cost of also higher prices with cost of unemployment. Okay, because when you start restricting these items and only rely on domestic companies to produce this, the cost for the consumer may go up as well. Okay, so protectionism, almost always there's a prospect of retaliation. Okay, so fighting unemployment, uh, is a tricky thing. It's not so obvious. I mean, the politicians will tell you up and down that we're going to fight unemployment, we're going to bring job back home, like Trump. Trump and many other politicians said bring job back home, and pressuring Apple, pressuring other companies to bring the job manufacturing into the United States, also pressuring foreign companies that make a lot of money in the US, whether it's the likes of Toyotas, Samsung, or Hyundai, whatever. They may pressure them to build manufacturing capacity in the United States. Otherwise, they're going to start intervening and erecting barriers. Now, what we have seen is that with the passage of NAFTA and then the second NAFTA, I don't like the new one. I don't know what they call it, USA, Mexico, Canada trade pact. A lot of these companies, in order to bypass the potential trade barriers and to take advantage of free trade agreement, have located through Mexico. And through Mexico, they have a gateway to Canada and U.S. lucrative markets, right? That's another way to. I mean, anytime a government intervenes and erect trade barriers, the company's going to look around and see where the loopholes are and how they can get around it to deal with it. Another economic rationale for government intervention, in addition to fighting unemployment, has been protecting infant industries. Okay, and according to this has been first, this notion of protecting infant industries came in 1792 by Alexander Hamilton. And the infant industry arguments hold that a government should temporarily shield emerging industries in which the country may ultimately possess a comparative advantage from international competition until its firms are able to effectively compete in the world market. So a lot of the emerging economies, when they engage in this protectionism, have argued that they have infant industries, industries that are tiny, industries that are weak, industry that's just getting started, and they need protection from foreign competition, assuming those foreign competitions are more wealthier, larger, more resource rich competition with a lot of years of expertise and know-hows and etc. So they say, if we permit the foreign competitions to come in openly, they're going to kill off our own industries that are just growing, that's just starting. We can't have that. It's not fair for our own company. They haven't had time to grow and garner knowledge and build up resources and know-how. So one of the arguments that are particularly made by emerging countries, is that we need help. We need help to increase our economies, increase employment, increase wealth, and so forth. In fact, they may even argue, if as a country, if we become more wealthier, we have more disposable income to buy your product. But what would be the point if you just come into our country and kill off all of infant industries? Right? Now, again, these are commonly used by developing countries. I can give you an example of South Korea. Now, some of the products that are coming out of South Korea. It's become one of the wealthiest countries in the world, but products like Samsung, Hyundai, and LG, and so forth, these are become very common products in Canada and United States now. But a number of decades ago, um, many years ago, in the 60s and 70s, South Korea was one of the poorest country in the world. In fact, it was a lot poorer than North Korea. If you think how bad the North Korea is now, one time South Korea was even poorer. In fact, the North Korean Communist Party says, see, this is what free market does, makes you more poor. So in those days, South Korea was so poor, uh, but the government, along with strategic alliances with industry groups, decided that they would protect some of these infant industries because every developing countries and emerging economies needs all the things that developed countries have. They need roads, they need buildings for their institutions, whether it's government institutions, schools, hospitals, and so forth. They need ships, they need cars, and so on and so forth. So there was actually a partner between the ch6, the group of industry like Samsung and LG and Hyundai and Kia and so forth, where the government provided protection for them from foreign competition, for them to grow domestically and become stronger and develop know-how. Secondly, whenever government needed these infrastructure improvements, and infrastructure build-up, they exclusively use these companies to help build their own infrastructures as well. So this infant industry argument, if it's carried out properly, can work. And other developed countries and rich countries may initially could not have cared. They say, oh, I don't care. They're so weak. Like, I mean, the country's so poor. Like, we have nothing to sell them at this point. We don't have to worry about them. They're not much of a threat or a competition. So for a very poor, weak developing country to use this rationale to intervene in the trade, in many cases, just are just ignored. I'm just saying, okay, yeah, we understand and so on. But if it's done properly, again, these industries can really grow. These companies can really grow and become a major competitors that you have now. Okay, so this argument for protecting infant industry has its rationale and the reasons and historical success for it. Okay. Um, uh, China, as the major emerging economy now, has used this argument as well. And has really engaged in some level of protectionism. If you also, I mean, China represents world's largest market, and Chinese government knows that. So if you want access to our largest market, you're going to have to pay the piper. Either do a joint venture with one of our domestic firms, or have a direct foreign direct investment to leave something. You can't just come into our country and just make profit and take the money away. It doesn't work that way. Chinese government doesn't. No sane government does that, as I've indicated many times. Now, it was interesting, just on the side, one of the Chinese scholars had written a paper arguing that one of the reasons why, and I disagree with it, but this was a number of years ago, and things are always changing. That one of the arguments he poses that Chinese companies would have a difficult time becoming a global competitor, major global competitors, because their own domestic market is so huge that there isn't a motivation to go beyond the border. There isn't a motivation to compete with foreign companies, because their own domestic market is so huge and growing, and there's no incentive for them to become a global competition. Okay, but that's not true. There's a number of Chinese company has become a global leaders. But again, back to protecting infant industry, that was another arguments that are particularly used by poor countries and developing countries. It's like, leave us alone. Like, and even if you leave us alone, we're not a threat anyway. In fact, as I said, they might argue, as we become more developed countries and the wealth increases, we will actually turn around and buy your product and services from a developed country anyway. Promoting industrialization is another argument. Okay. Um, uh, by promoting industrialization, improving comparative positions. Some of the arguments that are pushed under these headings have been uh, many of the emerging economies have, as I said, have engaged in protectionism to spur and promote local industrialization. Okay, and by promoting industrialization, the country are are able to utilize more of their workforce in the long run, be able to uh, become more wealthier, and then they can turn around and purchase their products as well. Another economic reasons why government intervene is that uh, if you restrict imports, like they have done with likes of Samsung and LG. As you know, Samsung and LG also produces appliances, like washing machine, uh, what do you call it, dryer and refrigerators and so forth. At one time, U.S. imposed a couple of years ago, I think, imposed a large tariff because they felt that they need to protect their own domestic appliance company like Maytag, Whirlpool. And so I think they imposed like 25% tariff on it. Okay. And of course they can't claim they're trying to protect their own domestic appliance stores, but appliances like Maytag, um, really the domestic appliance industry in the United States had heavily lobbied the US government to protect it from likes of LG and Samsung coming into their market. They could not compete in terms of innovation. They could not compete in terms of cost. So they needed help. Otherwise, they would have to close factories. They may have to relocate their manufacturing facilities somewhere else where it's cheaper and so forth. So that caused the politicians to respond to that by erecting tariffs, claiming that they're not going to straightforward say we're trying to protect our own industry, right? They're going to say something like, well, the appliance that are coming from abroad are being subsidized, made cheaper, subsidized by the governments, or they're selling it under cost in order to penetrate the market, and et cetera, et cetera. So what that caused is that caused Samsung and LG to set up their own manufacturing facilities in the United States. I think some of them are located in Georgia, in order to bypass the tariffs. So import restrictions does and can encourage foreign direct investment by the foreign companies that wants to avoid the loss of lucrative or potential markets, right? Samsung and LG could not, with that new tariff, compete effectively against Maytag. And they don't want to lose the U.S. market because that's a very lucrative market. So they had to figure something out, which was a foreign direct investment, just produce the goods in the U.S. And bypass the tariffs altogether. Okay. Some of the, there's a whole list of, there's a whole list of reasons why the economic rationale for government intervention. Okay. Fighting unemployment, we talked about that. Protecting infants industries, we talked about that. I've fallen behind. and so forth. So I think the textbook really goes through the various reasons why, uh, various specific reasons why uh, governments may intervene in their trade with other countries. Okay, I'm going to pause for now, and have part two in a minute. Okay, so this is end of part one for now.